desire to see the kingdom. In the midst of this, the Hasidic movement arises. The word Hasid is a word for like piety, a person who is charitable, a person who is religious, a person who is really seeking God. A lot of those meanings rolled into one. The Hasidic movement arises during a time when the doctrine of Orthodox Judaism, as found in the Talmud, is as clear as ice and twice as cold. Why? Because with this list of false messiahs, what the rabbis particularly did in the late 1700s is they tightened the screws because they didn't want any more false messiahs. The Orthodox rabbis of the day said, all of these false messiahs are killing us. Our people are dying following these false messiahs, and they're all false. So we have to more tightly control orthodoxy. None of this, display of emotion. Everything is very clear, sharp doctrine. Your behavior is very determined. It's very narrow. You've got to walk a very narrow path. And some individuals in poor communities in Eastern Europe said, we read the Torah and we see joy in the Torah. We read the prophets, we read the Psalms particularly. In Tehillim we see joy before God. And you're telling us to be extremely circumspect, make sure your socks are this way and your hair is that way. Everything was, and so out of this comes a rebellion by a man who is given the title, this is not his name, but he's given the title of the Baal Shem Tov. The word Baal Shem Tov is three Hebrew words that are very common actually. Baal means master, and Shem is the word name. Mahashem Shalcha. What is your name, you would say to a man. And the word Tov is Tov. It's good. The word Tov is good. So he is the master of the good name, Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov arises around the year 1700, and he says, we need to have joy in worship. And people start listening to him, and they say, that's right. We're not scholars. We don't live in Vilna. We're not in Poland, in Warsaw. We're here on this poor little farm of Anatevka. And we want joy. And they listen to the Baal Shem Tov. He assembles hundreds of disciples. Some of those disciples are very prominent individuals who gravitate toward his writings. And the Hasidic movement starts at this point. After the Baal Shem Tov dies, his followers develop various sects. He has maybe 12 or 15 very prominent men, middle-aged men, who then go to their own villages and start Hasidic movements of their own. The Hasidic movement is marked by a free-form expression of praise and worship, whereas rabbinical Talmudic Judaism is very prescribed. This is how you pray. These are the prayers. Don't deviate. The Hasidic movement would raise its hands and people would dance and people would shout and yell their prayers to God. It was a sort of heart response, much like they saw in the Psalms. They had thrown off the shackles of all of this described behavior, and the Hasidic sects began attracting many people. In each location, there was a Hasidic Rebbe in the areas that were affected by the Hasidic movement. And so you might have had a town, for instance, with the name of Lubavitch. And the Rebbe, Schneerson, who held sway in Lubavitch, they became known as the Lubavitcher Hasidim. There were other towns, Babov. If you were in the town of Babov in Eastern Europe, and you were the Rebbe, you were known as the Babov Rebbe. And the Hasidim around you became known as Babov Hasidim. Each of these groups grew in Europe. Ultimately, these groups would follow these Rebbes as miracle workers. They imagined that their Rebbe had the power directly, that he had a phone line, and that he could talk to God, and he could work miracles for them. To this day, the various Rebbes in and around the New York metro area and literally around the world to a same extent are visited by their followers, and they have whispered to them prayer requests. My wife and I have not been able to conceive. Would you please intervene with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, intervene with the Holy One, that we might have a child? And sometimes the Rebbe would say, you need to pray these prayers, or you need to go visit this grave site of this holy rabbi, you need to light candles, or you need to eat this sort of food, all sorts of things. It gets stranger and stranger the more that you go into it. And if they had a child a year later, they would attribute that to the intervention of the Rebbe. If you go around Brooklyn, not too far from where I grew up, there were a patchwork of different Hasidic sects. Right next to us was the Lubavitch Hasidim, Chabad. They are the largest Hasidic group. Across Brooklyn, in Borough Park, you had Babov. You had the Satmar Hasidim in Williamsburg, where my father grew up. Williamsburg was the Satmar Hasidim out of Satmar, Romania. And each of these groups were able to come to America. Most of them lost over half their members to the Holocaust. A lot of Rebbes were smuggled out of Europe in the 1930s when it became obvious that something bad was going to happen. They had no idea what. To this day, in America, but particularly in Israel, the power of the Rebbe has increased greatly. The power of the Rebbe is one of the problems that Medinat Yisrael has. Because if the Rebbe says one thing and the state of Israel is telling you another, you listen to the Rebbe and you go out in the street and you riot in Bnei Brak or wherever else you are in Israel. And so it doesn't take much rooting around the internet to find photo and video of young men in long black coats, Hasidim, fighting with Israeli police. Punches are being thrown. They're punching the police. These are Jews against Jews, because the Hasidim, these young rabbinical students, are controlled by the Rebbe, and what he says goes. So here's an example of some of these Hasidic sects. They are involved. So here in the lower left, maybe we can shut that this bank of lights over here. But in the lower left, you have one of the Rebbes. I believe this is one of the Babov sects. There are various, the switch, there you go. So here is probably the Babov Rebbe, and he is having petitions read to him. This might be, it looks to me like it might be a wedding ceremony. One of the most interesting things you could do is go on YouTube and search on the title Hasidic wedding celebrations. You'll see dancing, and you'll see merrymaking. You'll see just thousands of men dancing in uniformity to this. Thank you. You can turn the lights back on. So the Hasidic groups are very powerful in Israel and continue to be powerful in America. With the 1700s, with the 1800s, Europe is going to be shaken again. Jewish population increases in Western Europe because of the Enlightenment. The power of kings and despots are decreasing. There are increased calls for fairness in government, for accountability in government. And this starts to sweep through Western Europe in the 1840s, 1850s. You have the whole process here of the Enlightenment and the emancipation. Emancipation means you're coming out from under the condition of being serfs, serving a king, and you are now regarded as citizens. This was the great drama of the French Revolution, that you are a citizen and you have rights. And Europe would see this process from around 1770. Really, the American Revolution was one of the early harbingers of this. The fact that, why are you telling us how to live? We've been in America for 150 years. We have 2 generations of leaders who were born here in America. We don't want taxation without representation. And so it's part of that whole thing. Jewish population increases in Western Europe because it is Western Europe that is most feeling the effects of the Enlightenment. Democracy in some limited form are coming to many of the cities in Western Europe. Jewish people are leaving Eastern Europe because the Tsar and the kings and the despots still hold sway in Eastern Europe. And so Jews in the know, middle-class Jews, people with some money and education, are attempting to emigrate into Western Europe. We don't have real time to detail dates, but the emancipation of French and German Jewry basically comes in written proclamations from the 1830s up through the 1880s, and it comes in stages. There's not a single date that we can point to, but over the years, the various parliaments make formal declarations that the Jewish people of those areas are now full citizens. You're a full citizen of France, you're a full citizen of Germany, full citizen of Holland, and as such, people start to move into and take positions in the parliament. Jewish people would have influence. Occasionally, that influence was limited. You still, in places like England, you still had to be a member of the Anglican Church in order to get any place in society. An amazing study is the person of Benjamin Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli had parents who, at a young age, were converted by their parents because they were an educated family, they were a middle-class family, they desired higher education, and if you were not an Anglican, you couldn't get into certain schools. And so the parents of Benjamin Disraeli had been converted to Anglicanism, but they still held on privately to a sense of pride in being Jewish, and understandably so. Benjamin Disraeli has an extremely sharp mind, and he is able to work his way up through the boxing ring that doubles as the British Parliament, and he becomes Prime Minister. He's a member in good standing of the Anglican Church. It's the late 1840s, early 1850s, and he has an incredible responsibility because a brand new queen in her early 20s is now on the throne. She has little idea what to do, and she looks around for a friend. And Victoria finds a friend in Benjamin Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli continues to hold to an evangelical Christian understanding of the Bible. There are statements by Benjamin Disraeli that sound like he is an evangelist, where he's talking about the person of Jesus. But if his Jewish ethnic heritage was brought into question, he would defend it. And in Parliament, which is just like bare knuckles fighting, to Americans, we're just like astonished by when we see videos of Parliament, how they rise up and they yell and they insult one another. And we're civilized in America. We do that under the table, We do that privately and use the newspapers to do that. Things need to have decorum in Congress. So we fight things out in the newspaper and now in videos. And so Benjamin Disraeli defends his Jewish identity, and when an anti-Semitic member of Parliament arose and mocked Disraeli because of his Jewish origin, Benjamin Disraeli says, when his ancestors were groveling in caves, my ancestors were sitting on thrones in Jerusalem. And so Benjamin Disraeli was forever a champion of the Jewish people. But he was assimilated, and at the same time, he had successfully made his way into the British higher circles. There are movements out of England. The New World is discovered in 1492. Columbus sails the ocean blue, but of course the New World existed long before then, and Europeans had come to America long before then. History as it's taught to most Americans in the last 50 years is very English-centered. The reality is that the Spanish had communities in Florida and in Mexico long before the Mayflower sailed. But these were communities that often were populated by conversos, individuals fleeing the Spanish Inquisition coming to America. When scholars look at the log of the sailors on Columbus's ships, they believe that about a third of the names can reliably be traced to converso families, Jewish families who were forcibly converted to Roman Catholicism. These were individuals who didn't feel comfortable in that setting and sought to come to the New World. And so here in the New World, Judaism is going to find a much freer expression. The first Jews to land in the Western Hemisphere actually were Sephardic Jews from Portugal who landed in Brazil. The eastern part of Brazil, where it juts out into the Atlantic, hosted Jewish communities going back to the early 1500s. They were large communities. The Jewish community that came to America for the first time came not from Europe, came from Brazil. And they were Sephardic Jews. The first Jewish people in America were Sephardic Jews. Again, why? Constantly moving, every 2 generations, ear to the ground. Are we going to get persecuted? Who's going to take power? Will they persecute us? Should we make plans now to move? And they were always trying to keep one step ahead of that. Hence the move to New Amsterdam, which eventually became New York. It would be wonderful to have enough time to detail all of this, but we have very important matters ahead of us. One important matter that we need to discuss is the birth of Reform Judaism. We had said that Orthodox Judaism, really, up until around 1800, there is only one form of Judaism. It is Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism is directly descended from the Pharisees. It views the Talmud as its authority, and the Talmud is then interpreted in each local situation by the rabbis, and there's only one form of Judaism. Now, there were levels of observance. Some people kept kashrut very strictly and wouldn't eat outside of their home for fear that they were eating something that was not kosher. People just had levels of observance. But there was no form of Judaism that said you don't have to keep kosher. Every form said you need to keep kosher, but wink, wink, we know that sometimes you don't. But there's only one standard, and it's keeping kosher. In the 1820s, 1830s, in 2 places at the same time, in both England and most notably in Germany, there were Jews who were saying, this is ridiculous, that we are, the only way that we can be, quote unquote, good Jews is to dress in this archaic fashion as though we were in Poland in the 1600s. We are modern. It's modern times, after all. It's 1825. It's modern times. We're Englishmen. We're Berliners. We are Germans. We're proud to be Germans. My son is in the military academy. He's looking forward to being an officer in the German army. We are Germans who happen to be of Jewish religious persuasion. That's the change. They saw themselves first as Germans or as Brits, and my religion, I'm a member of the synagogue. But they didn't see Judaism as their ethnic identity. And this, folks, is going to be the big battle that continues to this day. The question is Jewishness an ethnic identity, or is it a religion? Those here to the right, to the more Orthodox, will say it is both. It is both an ethnic identity, it's something that you inherit, and it's a religious faith. The people on the left say, no, it's not an ethnic identity. It is a religion that anyone can embrace, and they are fully Jewish. Part of the motivation for people in liberal Reform Judaism, you see the phrase there, Reform Judaism, part of their motivation for coming up with a liberal Reform Judaism was the hope that if we remove Jewishness as an ethnic identity, then you no longer have a target of racial bigotry. If they're persecuting us because they are racial bigots, just your old garden variety racists, then if we say we're no longer a race and we dress like Germans, we dress like proper Englishmen, we use the Queen's English, we dine in good restaurants, and we show ourselves to be subjects of the Queen, then they have no reason to persecute us. That was the thinking. It was delusional. Because Satan is the prince of the power of the air. And this is where the covenant emphasis of this course comes in. You cannot explain all of what has happened in Jewish history by a purely rationalistic explanation. Because there are things that continue to happen in Jewish history that are determined by the covenants that God has made. The British Jews, the German Jews, the French Jews gave the greater societies around them, they gave them every reason for them to accept this group of people. They were loyal to France, to England, to Germany. They served in the army. They contributed to the opera house. They funded museums. They proudly sent their kids to be educated with the elite of the Gentile families. They tried to blend in every way. Theoretically, it should have been successful, except for the irrational, satanic thing known as anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism is going to continue to be the tool of Satan to drive a wedge between the Jewish people and the Jewish Messiah. Why? Because Jesus said, when the Pharisees rejected him, you're sending me away. And Arnold details this in great detail in his course. You're sending me away. You said I do my miracles by the power of Beelzebub. I'm going to go away, and I will not return. A day is coming when you will want me to return, but I will not return until the very same people who sent me away turn around and say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. Blessed are you who comes in the name of the Lord. The people who sent Mashiach King away are the same people who need to beg Mashiach King to come back. If the people who are the ones who need to ask for the Messiah to return, if they're being persecuted by people wearing crosses around their neck who have church memberships, then the last thing you want to do as a Jew is accept the God of those who have persecuted your people. It is a diabolical scheme of Satan that has influenced anti-Semitism for every intent and purpose, in an irrational way. Anti-Semitism has often been exercised to the detriment of the people who are perpetrating it. If Hitler had not been obsessed with killing all of the Jews in Europe, he could have devoted all of those rail lines and all of that petrol and all of those men that he spent in chasing around Jewish women and children to put them into gas chambers. That could have been a raid to make a fortress, and today Europe would be a Nazi country. It would be a single Nazi entity. But instead, irrationally, because anti-Semitism is irrational, he was controlled and worked in league with Satan. And the Holocaust, to this day, when you ask Jewish people, why can't you accept the reality of God in our lives? Why can't you see that God has worked in Jewish history? They would say one thing: the Holocaust, the Shoah. There is no God. Where was God when the 6 million were being murdered? That's their response. And some people are crippled by that response, because when you look at the images of the Holocaust, it was beyond horrific. Where was God? That's a whole other discussion we'll have in a couple of days. And so anti-Semitism becomes the irrational tool of Satan. And we're going to see it through history, where nations that could have done better by accepting the Jewish people irrationally tried to reject them and did that to their own detriment. Thus, the importance, as we stated on day one, of understanding Jewish history from the standpoint of the covenant promises. And that's what needs to undergird our study of Jewish history. Thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow.